it has likes for me. Anyway.
Okay, so today we're celebrating the fact that I've sublated the difference between my slides and my drawings into slides made of drawings. So yeah, and also, I mean, two things to clarify. The idea for the discussion on the body, I thought of coming up with an itinerary for this that is like this. My idea today was to kind of finish with a formal presentation, do it as a whole, and to do a bit of a summary, in fact, of some of the stuff from the previous books that we need to make sense of the theory of bodies. Then we would go through, my idea for the second meeting was to have a very broad conceptual discussion of Badiou in the context of some stuff, some speculative questions about possible developments out of the book. Then the third meeting, the idea was to do this political interlude and and benefit from the fact that Dennis already worked on this, and the fact that in our cycling of readings, it ended up that Dennis only had one book rather than two like everyone. So my idea was to share with him the last 3 meetings. So one meeting.
Wait a minute, he has conclusion.
Yeah, but come on, man. It's like, it's called, come on. Let's be serious.
And there was a big mathematical interlude. It's almost like a book there, right? So.
Yeah, that was kind of a book in itself.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I can remove you from the.
No, I'm happy to
yeah.
have
so my
another
idea
shot.
was for us to discuss, to take one meeting to do. We had an artistic interlude, we had a mathematical interlude, so we would have a political one, and it would be a sort of evocation of this Monday group meeting and the stuff that we already.
If I have a talk in the plenary, I might give you a love interlude.
There you go. So there's that. And then for meetings 4 and 5, my idea was to bring Yasha in, because Yasha, Dennis, and we've been talking about the bridges between logics of roles and being an event, and actually a bit of immanence of truth as well. So the connection between the concept of ultrafilter that comes from immanence of truth, the whole discussion on bodies in logics of roles, and the whole forcing in being an event. So for us to spend a couple of meetings on this, which I think would be a nice way to end it, because once we started going back to being an event, it's crazy how consistent the two things are. Like, and there are paragraphs that seem to be from the same book, like time didn't pass. So there's a proof of eternity we can empirically give. Like the sentence began in 1987 and it was ended in 2006. Like perfectly fitting. It's really weird. So my idea is to have then 3 meetings at the end of our discussions that cover this material. Some politics, and then 2 meetings on the relation between logics of roles and other stuff. For today, my idea is to do like a very quick, which is probably not going to be the case, but let's try, kind of a quick formal recapitulation of the stuff we saw in the other books. After all, we're finishing the whole thing, so it's nice to have like a previously in logics of worlds. So we can see what we covered, because we need a lot of that material now. It becomes clear, I think, in the theory of bodies, why the hell so much effort went into all these other definitions and how they play into this. Perhaps the only thing that really stands out as being kind of irrelevant is the theory of relations. But other than that, almost everything is mobilized. And then to present the theory of bodies, which I divided into 7 points. The chapter is very short, in fact, but I just think that these are the concepts, really. The incorporation, body, what he calls corporeal synthesis, the idea of efficacious part, the idea of organ, which is almost the same, in fact. Then this whole typology of worlds that we can make, he actually gives us a list of types of worlds. And then I wanted to, as almost like an exercise left to the reader, to discuss this thing that he brings in the Scholium called subjective induction. So we can talk about that as well. But basically, the idea in the formal recapitulation is to discuss stuff we'll need for later. So I actually transcribed practically all the main formal stuff from the whole book and just kind of added a bit of a blue blue marker on stuff that we will need. So for example, from the transcendental operations from book 2, some stuff is relevant because events will require us to understand what dependence is and how it's structured, and points, we know that they are specific forms of morphism that preserve conjunctions and envelopes, right? So they're called like that.
Yeah, from the theory of points.
Yeah, so we'll need that. So I'll go quite quickly. It's almost like we're reading the statements at the end of the book, but I think that it would be worth stopping at points where things are unclear or something like this.
Just a little question. How did you make those slides? Did you wrote by hand or did you wrote in your computer? Just because it's very, very pretty.
Yeah, by hand, man. I'm
by
practicing.
Hand. So
yeah.
you took picture of your handwriting.
No. I wrote it straight on the page.
Okay.
I understood your question wrong. No, I just wrote it like this.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So we know that he begins with this definition of a world. I actually propose that we consider this first definition, right? That there are many worlds to be a sort of zero postulate of materialism, that there is no whole. I think it kind of the idea that every world has a reference set, right? Every world has a domain. I think that's actually the sort of zero materialist postulate, in fact. So we begin from there. We have his definition of the transcendental. We know the definition of degrees. We know that the transcendental is endowed with an order structure. And then we have the operations, right? I think they're pretty clear: the minimal, the conjunction, the envelope. And actually, the one thing that I wanted to discuss with you guys here at this very early stage, I think you guys remember that in my presentation of the book on the object, I tried to preface it with something that was helpful to me, but I think it was helpful to some point, but not entirely accurate. So even though it gave me some insight, I think that it's not necessarily the best description. Let me just see what's going on here. My screen just froze for a second. But I don't know if you guys remember, I kind of started off with this sort of comparison between the set and the power set, and the fact that the power set has a relation to the pose set, right? The power set has an order structure, which is just kind of derived or a sort of implied by the very superposition between its subsets, right? So if you have a set AB, you have a power set with those subsets, and they kind of already include one another in this pose set structure here, right? So what I wanted to do, I wanted your guys to help me with, because I'm trying to think of an intuitive way to move from this intuition, which I think is quite simple. It's easy to present for a student, for example, to move from this to the idea of pointless topology. So how would you do it in like intuitive steps, right? So I came up with this idea, but I'm not sure if it holds up. So I just want to run it by you, which is, we start with a finite set. And we know that if we have a finite set, we have a certain space of possible subsets. And if you analyze the space of subsets, which is already implied by the set itself, you see that it's already implied a certain lattice structure of how these things overlap, right? So you know that in A and B is contained both A and B. So you have A and B below A and B here, right? As the envelope or the union of both. And you know that the empty set is the conjunction of A and B because they have nothing in common. So I thought of, well, first step you can do to explain to somebody how you move towards the intuition we're looking for is, well, the first thing, which is what Badiou already does in being an event, is imagine that you move from the finite to the infinite. Some qualitative things change just by making that quantitative change. Because if you have an infinite set, the power set, you know some stuff about it, but you don't know that much anymore, right? You know that there is something like a largest part. You know that the singletons of this infinite set are there. You know that there is the empty set, but you don't know much more than that. Plus, there is a bunch of new questions about the relation between the two things. That's why I added a little star here, right? Plus, if you start now thinking about the same order structure for an infinite power set, it will get really complex. So I think that helps to get the intuition that the lattice structure for the overlapping of subsets of an infinite set can be already a crazy, huge ordering structure that's not totally ordered and so on and so forth, right? Then I thought, well, the second step you could make is say, well, but this pose set, this power set, it's still containing the closed subsets of S. So perhaps after moving from the finite to the infinite, we could move from the closed to the open. So we still have an infinite set, but now we have a largest part and we have a bunch of open subsets. And we have the empty set. As we know that there is a largest part and we know that there is an empty part, but everything else is now more loosely defined because it's the open subsets of S, no longer the closed. So we perhaps can already define it as a sort of topology. Perhaps people can intuit that this becomes a sort of connected space, right? But we still are not where we want to go. So my idea is like, then after the intuition of the finite moving to the infinite and the closed moving to the open, you can have the intuition of moving from point to a pointless topology. So you can, which I define in this way, which I'm not sure is the correct way exactly, but which is to say, rather than define the lattice structure on the points of the power set, let's define the lattice structure on the continuous functions that can be mapped from the set, right? So you're not counting elements, you're counting discontinuous functions. And then the fact is that, well, somehow that's why I added the asterisk here. Well, you don't know much about this, how this thing is structured. So you now learn about this space, which you don't know about very much because it has no points, by looking at the lattice structure. So at this point here, the topology was telling you something about the lattice because you have the open subsets, they overlap in this and that way, so on and so forth. But when you move to this structure here, is actually kind of the inverse, right? And the definition of a locale actually involves the inverse mapping from the lattice to the topological space, because it's precisely the ordering of the functions that is going to tell you something about the topological space. That's why it's not defined by the points. It's pointless in that sense. So I wonder if this is a way of approaching this first that seems intuitive, like if this seems to you guys like good steps, you know, because I'm interested in this also for didactic reasons, so I can actually present this and talk to people about it. But also I think that the definition of locales and frames, it's definitely more sophisticated. So I'm not sure if I'm missing something that I should include here.
I would include that in a topology, you don't need the entire power set, right? You only need a subset of the power set which is closed under conjunction and envelopes.
So I cannot assume that the largest part is here.
No, the largest part is always there. Yeah, that's true. The largest and the smallest are always there.
Yeah.
And then there are arbitrary unions and finite intersections.
Yeah.
Right. So, but that means the power set is only one particular topology, which is the most discrete topology. It is the one where every point is in its own open set.
Yeah. Is this a Hausdorff thing we were talking about?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I think Hausdorff is meaning that every point, any 2 points have a open set, 2 open sets that are different, disjoint open sets.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So that it means that they are Yeah, no, it is not. It doesn't imply the same thing. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if that you can tell if something is Hausdorff in that way. But anyway, yeah, just the point is that you can select different topologies besides it's a looser condition because you don't need just the entire power set. You can take a chunk of it.
Yeah, that's what actually I wanted to get at with this, but it's not very clear yet. I think this what you're talking about is something a bit looser that should be defined on this part, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
From the power set to a topology. Yeah, this difference is important, right? Because this can actually be included here, right? It doesn't need to be the maximal. It's not even inclusion. Like it can just be distinct, right?
Yeah. I mean, it will be. Is it included? I think it is included. But yeah, it's some piece of the power set. Yeah.
Yeah, but the thing that I wanted to do with this, I think it's captured in that idea, is that as the moment that once you move to the infinite and then you're looking at open subsets, you get a more obscure or more, let's say, diverse possibilities for what this topological space is, right? For this intermediate point or structure, and to the point that it becomes useful to investigate it through the lattice. That's where I wanted to get at, right? It's not because at this point here, like when you begin, it seems like the two things they coincide, right? Having a good view of a power set gives you the ordering structure. The idea that you can learn about the space of possible differentiations, right? By looking at the lattice and its properties, right? That's what I think that this pointless topology does in a way. Like it makes this transcendental structure in our parlance, right? The entry point to discuss a space that is not so transparent at first, right? It becomes a bit of an opaque in between the extension of reference set and the transcendental. No wonder that Badiou moves from being an event here at the level of the set, right? To the transcendental and then to atomic logic, which is like reconquering this space in a way.
By the way, you're right. Yeah, in the discrete topology, it is Hausdorff.
Yeah, I thought I read that today somewhere. Anyway, this is a sidetrack just because I feel like finding a good intuition to justify these things, you know, and to make the formalism something that is desirable and something.
I'm a little bit lost in this. You said that the goal of this formalism is didactic. I mean, what is it? What is it that this is telling us that that
it's not for you, Reza. It's for students. So I can present to other people what we're doing in a way that they understand.
Yeah. No, well,
it won't tell you anything new.
that makes it even more difficult for me because I didn't understand this one either.
Yeah, I mean, my point is just like, how do you relate the locale structure, which is this sort of infinite partial order with some extra conditions, right? How do you relate this sort of transcendental structure to the thing it's somehow easier to present to people about the state of a situation as a sort of power set of a set.
I see.
Right, so I'm trying to see what other moves did we make so we can kind of leave behind the set theoretical description, but at the same time feel kind of there is an intuition behind discussing this lattice structure and the complete Heyting algebra and so on. Like, but it's not meant to add any new information. Like, it's just meant to try to make that kind of shift in intuition.
And the move from points to pointless is helping how?
Well, the complete Heyting algebra is the algebraic structure of this locale, right? Now, locale is dual with it has this. It's treated in topology as this thing called a pointless topology, right? Because as we saw, and this is the problem of the theory of the object, right? From the degrees, you don't infer directly elements. You actually need to build back the coverings of the space and then postulate that they correlate with, they are supported by an element of the multiple. So you need to kind of conquer back the multiple from the transcendental, right? The connection is not direct because the ways we are allowed to cover, glue, or separate, or compose the differential structure of a world is not directly mappable to elements, extensionally distinct in that absolute difference that we have from the set theoretical perspective. Like what we gained is precisely a differential space where differences don't have a direct commitment to extensional difference. Though we can recuperate extensional difference because we can come up with a real atom, right? We do have some degrees of freedom that we didn't have with the set theoretical approach. That's what makes the analysis of worlds so rich, right?
Yeah, and actually, this step from points to pointless seems to be the hidden or the missing chapter in Badiou, because he goes directly to hiding algebra.
Yes, that's what I wanted to get at. Like, I had so much trouble moving from the book of the transcendental to the object, because when he wrote the ID function, I always assumed that the parts that are being related are, I mean, that the atoms and that the components, they always mapped to like clear and distinct closed sets, subsets. Like, so if I had A and B in a subset and I wanted to like with a predicate select something, right? That I would always be selecting exactly one element that belongs exactly to A. But that's actually what the postulate of materialism guarantees. The phenomenal component in itself doesn't. Like you might be selecting something more gradient or more loose or more fuzzy than that, right?
Yeah.
And that wasn't clear for me because the pointless aspect of the complete Heyting algebra, or the fact that it occludes the reference to points, it explains two things. Why it's so great for us, right? If it was about points, meaning if we're dealing with well-defined closed sets, subsets of a power set, the ontology would be over-determining appearance, right? Differences would ultimately always be extensional differences. And that would make for a very poor phenomenology. So Badiou actually takes a lot of advantage, a lot of nuance comes from the fact that you're dealing with a pointless topology. And on the other hand, this explains why it is so amazing that atomic logic recuperates something about ontology, right? Why the transcendental functor and all those things are so crucial. Because even though you explore the pointless space through this lattice structure, its constraints and its possibilities actually tell you something about this. So even though you acquired a lot of nuance, you can still refer back to the multiples and actually say some stuff about them, right? Like, so, well, if an atom, if a phenomenal component is atomic, and if that atom has some support on the actual multiple, you can actually have an ontological definition of ordering and a real synthesis, right? So like the value of those things only makes sense if you first, like the drama of it only makes sense if you first realize that you lost it and now you regained it. If you think that you never lost it, you don't think much of it afterwards, right? Like if you always dealt with well-defined extensional points, to find an envelope is only to find the set that contains it, and that there you go, envelope done. But once this nuanced space is your home, the fact that you can trace it back to some specific set that contains the subset, but perhaps not its immediate container, right? It's actually a big jump, like it's a big victory. So the real part of the real synthesis makes more sense, I think. So I'm not sure. I don't think that the way I just presented this is final. I don't think it's the best way to do it, but I feel like managing to make this part of it clear, right? Or making this jump in intuition clearer is really helpful to make the transition from the transcendental to the object and to the atomic logic also more relevant, you know?
I think one nice way to think of it is the space of material and the space of differences. Like the ontology gives us a very clear-cut sense of difference, and with the subset relation, it gives us already this structure that looks like a lattice also. But the hiding algebra or open set locale thing is a almost like arbitrary space.
Yeah, exactly.
That so it's very crazy that you can take something and reconfigure it in a different space.
Like Carol and I were talking
it.
about this earlier. I think it's like this, like ontologically is imagine that you have this sort of angel of ontology. He's a bureaucrat. He's totally indifferent to reality. And he just makes a list, like the ontological eye that Badiou talks about in the beginning of the object chapter. He just makes a list of everything. It's an infinite list. Only an infinite bureaucrat could make it, you know, like there is a computer, the computer has this and that part has this and that subpart has this and this. It's like a huge infinite list. If you then try to track what is inside of what, just their extensional relations, you will already get a very complex lattice, right? But once you try to go from this material containment to difference, as you said, well, the dirt in the computer that's on the left side of my computer and the dirt that is on the right side of my keyboard, they don't really make a difference, right? I can kind of treat them as one, whereas the screen and the keyboard make a big difference. They're very distinct. Like that's not something that this bureaucratic ontological angel cares for, right? You need a phenomenological eye to see that. But when you start thinking about the space of those differences, that space doesn't carry over the same properties of the material containment structure. So the dirt and the keyboard, it's true that the dirt is contained in the keyboard. Sure, okay, so it's coherent with the material. But how big a chunk of dirt counts as, or dust counts as one thing, right? Or how do you divide it? And all those things suddenly come from different space. And it's a pointless space in the sense that dirt doesn't refer to a specific number of particles, right? It has some nuance, some indistinction. So the colors also come in and like they're gradient, they're not clear. Like the dirt in my screen also makes it less glossy here and less reflective there. So you get a space that doesn't directly map to the material containment structure of ontology. The crazy thing is that you can actually then refer back to it and learn stuff about it, right?
Exactly, yeah. A nice example is like how many grains of sand go from a grain to a mound of sand.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like questions like this that you cannot really answer them in.
Yeah, the ontological angel doesn't give a shit. Like he would say, there's infinite, like there's I don't know how many billions grains of sand. That's what it is. Like it's extensionally equivalent. Don't bother me with this, right? And it takes a particular world to make that cutting point of the threshold and things like this. So there is some move that I think from points to pointlessness, which is very important didactically, both to show why the complete Heyting algebra is so powerful, right? We let go of the definition of points. Like what counts as a point is what coheres in the lattice, right? So the point is defined by the order and not the thing being ordered. That's what being there means, right? The differential structure defines the unity and not is the unity that is then given a differential value. The weird thing is that even once you do that passage, you can still track back to the material containment that ontology extensionally defines. and find correlations, right? And move from one to the other, but you still gained a lot that is not contained in that material list, right? So it's a bit of this that I wanted to capture, but I think it's still a bit loosey. Like if you guys have any idea of how to make this clearer or something like that, it'd be really helpful. But I think that there is something in this movement from finite to infinite, closed to open, which is already something that kind of juggles your intuition, right? Because you move to this topology, but then you can have many, then you see that it's not the same. The space becomes more nuanced already. And then from open subsets, which are still remain the points which are ordering, you move to a sort of ignorance about them, and you you only have the lattice to give you the information about the things you're ordering, right? And then you require, I mean, the result, what I think is called stone duality, which allows you to make this move from frames to this topology, and what I think it's called sober spaces, the space of all the continuous functions that you can make in this way. That this is dual, and you can actually move from one to the other and learn about one through the other. That's, let's say, the big trick, right? The big kind of the crucial result, right? But anyway, I don't want to lose too much time on this, but I just think there's something nice to meditate about and to come up with a way of presenting this, because
doesn't Badiou add a kind of proviso in terms of especially going back to the discrete space, the space that it has points, from the indiscrete space, the continuous space, which is the lattice, by saying that this has to be a region of a single object? Or what I'm trying to say is that it is not the fact that you can move from the lattice to the subset, from the indiscrete to discrete, through any part of the lattice. Like if you get an arbitrary part of lattice, it is not guaranteed that you find a discrete representation.
Not at all, yeah.
Because they have to, the indiscrete part, the part that you are selecting, has to be a region of an object.
Yeah, but I mean, the definition of object is also loose, right? To be a region of an object can mean different things for different reference sets and different ID functions. So the thing that is a component for an object, it might be an object with its own components as well. But I think that what you're saying is essential, because there are specific conditions you need to meet, right? We're actually moving from points to pointless to atoms. Atoms substitute points, I think. But they're a unity, right? This oneness that is logically consistent, and you derive its ontological consistency out of that. But it's first a logical construct. So you need to find this sort of logical coherence, which is the atomic component. And only in that case can you then kind of recuperate some notion of points, right? But it's, again, going from the lattice back to the set.
And isn't this guarantee of, okay, so I'm thinking about, again, I think we discussed this, about analyzing an image by a computer program, and being able to identify what objects are in that image. So the computer program can see gradients and gradients of shades and colors and stuff like that, and need to analyze those gradients and shapes and shapes into discrete objects. That this is, for example, a temple, and these are the columns, and this is like the pond, and these are the women in the water, or clothes, or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So the postulate of materialism says that what appears in the world are multiples, and bottom line is that the appearance, which at the end we call an object that belongs to the phenomenology, is always supported by an underlying object as an underlying multiple. That's a very powerful statement. This is like probably, if not the most powerful statement in the book, but like one of the most. So basically, he says that this computer program needs to understand this postulate of materialism, that these gradients that are within this picture are related, ultimately related to multiple beings. And hence, there is some sort of underlying relation that it needs to maintain in order to basically say what that multiple is for each of these combinations of gradients. Like, I think similar to the ontological I that you said. That ontological I is what at the end the computer program needs to maintain, like a catalog of all the possible objects that can contribute to these combination of shades or shapes.
Yeah, but the computer is actually constrained by the sensors, the data, a bunch of things that actually make a cut in the multiple. Like, it analyzes some stuff, but it doesn't analyze others. Like, it doesn't exhaust the ontological lists, for sure.
I mean, if it could, I mean, like for example, like years ago when we were programming in Prolog, we had to create, which is a logical programming language, we had to create a logical repository of all the possible combinations, right? So that logical possibility of all the combinations are, in this example, would be similar to the ontological list of all possible combinations of objects. So if you go back to the pointless and pointed diagrams, in order to move from lattice to the power set, from indiscrete to discrete, you need to be able to understand what are the possible combinations of objects, sorry, multiples. Because in the lattice, you can have orders that have nothing to do, or may not, you have to allow for this possibility, may not have anything to do with the possible combinations of multiples, right? So my question then is then this. Isn't this possibility also the relation that you have between, how can I show this? I don't see it. The relation that you are drawing here or here, is it not also guaranteed by postulate of materialism? That everything that appears here, all the possible structure that is appearing in the lattice is already guaranteed by this via the postulate. And that's why we need a postulate, because this space is inaccessible by this space, theoretically. That's why we need a postulate to say that the order in this space is determined by the order in this space.
Yeah, I would put it slightly different, because I think his point is not that it's determined, but it's constrained, like in the sense that
yes,
we won't accept elements, we won't accept the reality of atoms, which we cannot confer some extensional multiplicity to support, right? So virtuality is not ontological, right? Or is not
which is
irreducible.
Already pointing to the difference between the Deleuze and Deleuze.
Yes. Yeah, I think if I follow what you said, yeah, I agree with you. I think that that's the point, right? The issue, the reason why I think this pointless thing is important is precisely to show why the postulate of materialism is an addition. Because if you were at this point here, right, from being an event and so on and so forth, you don't need a postulate of materialism. Like I define this ordering structure from the power set. So I've never left the determinations, the extensional determinations, right? The differential space here is extensionally determined. So I didn't lose track of this at any point. So there's no reason of affirming that I need it, right? It's only because you lose track of this extensional difference, because you get a much richer sense of difference that is much more nuanced, that then you need to decide on the correlation of this with the support set, right?
Yeah. Also, one thing to remember is theoretically you started with the set and you went to the world, right? You started with ontology, went to the world, but actually in everyday life, it's the world is all we have access to.
Exactly.
So actually, in that sense, ontology comes second. It's
exactly.
I mean, if you want to explore a world, Badiou is saying when you explore the world, you're also exploring being.
Yeah.
Yeah, to some extent, right? Because every difference you find in the world must be backed up by a difference in being.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's a good idea. I mean, the reason why I wanted to focus on this is because I think it also helps to realize that this is really how it goes, right? The logics of worlds is a bigger thing, and being an event is a smaller thing. It's not the inverse, right? So being there is this general logic. And it takes even further restricted discourse to be able to cut this and just get this, right? It's a reduction.
Yeah.
Like you need to further refine this structure to get something even more precise or more restrictive to only extensive differences, which already cut off a bunch of differences here, right? To move from here to here.
Yeah, I always had to repeat what Dennis said to myself, that actually these books are from the perspective of the natural approach, the pragmatic approach should be written in the reverse order. We actually are not written in the reverse order, but are treating the matter in reverse order.
That's why he says it's like phenomenology and science of logic.
Right.
But just so we don't lose track. So from the
what's the science of logic there in that comparison?
It's logics of worlds.
Logics of worlds is science of logic.
Yeah, he says it in the transcendental chapter. Like, this is my science of logic.
Yeah, don't remember. Yeah, no, whatever.
Does he? No, I think he actually makes the inverse, right? Being an event is the science of logic, and this is the phenomenology.
Yeah, this I don't think it works. Like being an event being the science of logic. Yeah, whatever.
Yeah, I don't know how to make that, because there is phenomenology in one and logic in the other. So which one is to choose? But anyway, like from the transcendental chapter, I think the crucial thing. I mean, this discussion that we were having, it's interesting, but it's a sidetrack and something that I want us to just keep in mind, because I find that having a good intuition of what we're actually dealing with is not easy, and it's good to have like some didactic way to approach this so we can use it in other situations. But the crucial thing, I think, is the operator of dependence, right? Which requires the understanding of envelope and conjunction and minimal and so on, just so that it defines implication, P implies Q, to the measure that you can define this envelope of a certain region that contains everything that is connected to P while remaining the closest to Q, right? So T, such that the conjunction between P and T, so the common part of them, is smaller than Q, smaller or equal than Q. because this will play a role in the site discussion, but I think it also plays a big role afterwards when we're talking about events and so on. So then we get to the chapter on the object, which I think should just be called atomic logic. Ultimately, here it's crucial because points require the compatibility clause. Bodies go through the process of real synthesis again, so we need to recap what those things mean, right? Function of appearing, I think we're tired of it already. We all know how it goes. The definition of phenomena, right? Definition of existence, which turned out to be retroactively much more important than it seemed when we were reading the object chapter, right? From the pre-atomic part of the object chapter, actually existence is the part that comes back throughout the book. I think that we actually made really good use of the problem of the phenomenal component and its relation to the atomic component, because that's how we introduced, in a certain sense, the issue of resolutions into Badiou's logics of worlds, right? We realized that atomic components are actually defining a certain predicate that covers the space in a certain way, right? And the atomic component actually is a form of covering the space or finding certain questions, as Dennis put it, right, that abide to some basic constraints, which I propose we call it like the analytic, the synthetic constraints. Like there's actually three: analytic, synthetic, and ontological constraints, while also respecting phenomenal logic, right? So the atomic components need to be analytically, they are components, so things that we can separate with predicates, which have the highest degree of belonging, so they are maximally belonging, such that any other element is either smaller or identical to it. So it doesn't need to be maximal, but the highest. So it can be P degree of belonging, so that there is no degree above P, even if P is not a maximal, right? So it's the thing that belongs the most to that multiple. So in the analytic condition would be this unicity condition of the atom. It's the resolution or the predication or the way of slicing or covering this this multiple, so that the covering singles out something which belongs maximally or the highest degree to that object, right? So that's the analytic one. But then there's a syntactic condition which we see after this, which is that atoms allow us to localize other atoms. So the intuitive way I think about this is like the proper language to describe a scene is a language that covers that space in a way that allows me to define what is a unity in that space, but also allows me to relate to other things in that space. So, for example, if I'm looking at a play with some actors and I name the actor, rather than name the character, I name the actor, I did relate to something unique, like that's Tom Cruise, but I cannot relate him to everyone else in the scene because that predicate doesn't localize the other things. Like, sure, that guy's Tom Cruise, but what does that say, or how does that allow me to talk about the other characters with regards to Tom Cruise? It doesn't. So it respects the analytic condition, but doesn't respect the synthetic one, which is the gluing condition, right? You want your atoms to both be to have this unicity. They single something out, some region out, but they also allow you to localize other things with regards to it, right? So you will choose the name of the character because you can actually localize other characters through the name of the character, right? And third condition, which is the ontological, is that whatever it is that has some unicity and some synthetic coherence also is supported by an extensional multiplicity, right? So if you selected something which has no support, is like just I don't know how we would define, like a virtual coherence, that wouldn't function as well for him in his materialist ontology. So we would have those three conditions that I think intuitively can be thought in this way. Analytically, you are looking for unicity. You want to arrive at components that single out some level of unity or oneness, but that oneness needs to cohere. So you might actually find different ways of singling things out. The guy with the funny nose, that's a way of singling someone out, but that might not allow you to localize, for example, other people based on their different traits. So that wouldn't be, let's say, the right resolution or the right, let's say, language game for that. It wouldn't be the atomic game for that object, right? So he also shows us that an atom defined in this way, it actually preserves these two important axioms of phenomenal logic, right? So you can operate with this components, and to treat objects to treat phenomena through their components actually amounts to treating the identity function. It respects the same property, so you didn't lose the information that you had from the more broad, coarse-grained transcendental analysis, right? Not even coarse-grained, but like just purely transcendental. So you're already closing into the actual coverings of the space. And then, as Reza was saying, the very strong postulate of materialism, which is, well, this atom defined in this way, right? It has this unicity, or to go back to the way I proposed, right? This analytic, synthetic conditions. It actually, by the postulate of materialism, is connected to an ontological condition, which is, if you can single this out, and reminding what we said before, this is actually a region in a pointless space. So you actually are singling out something based on the degrees of a transcendental that has no respect for extensional difference. And he's saying that once you've met these two clauses of singling out in that nuanced, fuzzy space, something that is unique and that coheres, right? That where he's putting his money on, he's wagering that there is an ontological substrate that goes with it. And for him, every atom also is a real atom. And then he shows that once you define the real atom in this way, as being supported by an actual element of the referential set, it still abides to the phenomenological constraints. So you don't lose the ID function. That's why it's beautiful, right? This is coming from the transcendental. This is coming from the transcendental with regards to the covering space of those functions we were talking about. And if you move from these two to the ontological substrate, you preserve the information that you had here, right? So in my opinion, this is kind of like bringing together a sort of language approach, like a language game approach, which I think is this here is very well treated by predicate logic and the proper language that organizes a space, so on. This is clearly transcendental, right? But this brings these two back together to a materialist perspective, right?
Also brings together the two books.
Exactly, brings together a lot of stuff, in fact. And then he gives the definition of object, which after all of that he's already done at this point, seems actually so simple, but it's actually very profound, right? An object is composed of a multiple A and an ID function, which is not the ID function because there are infinite ID functions for a transcendental, right? Where all atomic components are real atoms. So that's the definition. Then we get to this is where the book gets really juicy and also much more complex, right? Because this is where now we go into the atomic logic proper, where we get those three operations of localization, compatibility, and order. And I mean, I feel like the compatibility property is actually the most important property of the whole book. There's not one cool thing about logics of worlds that doesn't have between brackets, well, if atoms are compatible in pairs. So transcendental functors, real synthesis, envelope, bodies, points, I mean, compatibility, without compatibility, we couldn't do that jump back to the multiple and have information about the world. right?
Yeah, that is also the condition we were talking about, the jumping from pointless to point.
Yeah, which is amazing because we're not jumping to point, right? We're jumping from atom to real atom. And I think that's important because the atom is a logical thing that is bringing us back to ontology, but not through, let's say, removing the logic and just seeing ontology, right? Forget about this other structure. Look back at extensional structure. You get the extensional information by looking at the logical information, right? If things cohere in this way, you can bet that there is some extensional coherence behind it. But that doesn't mean that you suddenly have direct access to the extensional coherence. You're still dealing with this topological nuanced space, but you're looking into properties that exploit or are tangent to the extensional differences, right? So it's not really a return to points in a simple sense. So we get here honestly, in the whole book, this is something for me that was very profound, like the discussion on localization, which is something I still I don't think I can explain in a clear way or didactic way, but it's the thing that changed my intuition and my sensibility the most in the book. This idea of sort of, I mean, it's the place in the book where I got the strongest feel for a phenomenology where objects appear to objects or components appear to themselves and not to me, right? This idea of how you can localize something on something else. I find that to be like one of the high points of the book as well. And it has this crucial point, right? We had a definition of atoms. We talk about the conjunction between an atom and a degree, right? He calls this a localization, right? So you kind of filter the degree, filter the atom through a certain degree, right? And he shows that the derived function. So for example, if I have the localization of A on P, so let's say you're now considering that atom from the perspective of a certain degree, right? The function of A localized on P can be treated itself as an atom, right? So it's a sort of generative principle. If something is an atom and you can localize something through it, you can also use that new localization to localize something new, right? And there is, I think, the big jump here, the big genius of it is that if this is the case, right? So if the A localized on P of X, right? It's equal to, for example, if it is an atom, that means that there is an element B in the support set, which is the thing that is being related to the X that you're localizing, right? So there is an element B, which is an element of A, and we can write B as being equal to the localization. So there is actually a recasting of localization of A in an ontological way. So we begin this process of localization with a sort of support, a kind of correlation between the atom and the support set, right? But we end actually getting the value of the localization itself also being an element in the support set. So that's kind of like the first big retraction of this logical analysis of coherence inside of world onto the elements themselves, right? Then comes compatibility, which, as I said, I think it's the big clause of the book, right? A and B are said to be compatible with the localization of A on the existence of B equals the localization of B on the existence of A, right? Remembering that this localization means the conjunction between the atom A of X and the identity of B with itself, right?
I wanted to, because you brought up the two parts of the atom, the analytic and the synthetic, right? I was thinking to bring it back to the food metaphor again, like Well, we have to throw that in, right? Because
Of course. Now we need to. We probably should have a degustative interlude.
that's true. Yeah. Yes. So I was thinking if one atom is spiciness, and another atom is, let's say, I don't know, like saltiness. Okay, then localization. We can think of localization as producing like a new predicate almost, which is whether we localize spiciness on saltiness or vice versa, we localize saltiness on spiciness, you get another measuring stick, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that seems to fit in the synthetic part, right? Analytic would mean what is the
Predicates
part
that actually get us something unique, right?
Exactly. What is the unique element of spiciness and what is the unique element of saltiness? That's analytic. But then the composition.
No, sorry. I would just separate what you said into two. Like, what is the unique? The predicate that separates something unique is not the same thing as the predicate that separates something unique, which has a unique element, right? Which is, let's say, the spice element in the support set of the spice atom, right? I mean, that's just so we can have also analytic, synthetic, and ontological, right?
Right. Yes.
So I have a question. You said that saltiness, but saltiness cannot be an atom. Saltiness is a predicate, right? An atom in this case would be something that resolved to a particular saltiness, which is in this case would be an ingredient of a food, not saltiness itself.
No, but it is saltiness itself, because I think that's what that equation of the alpha equals A equals identity, right? Those three elements, making them all equal means that to have a predicate implies having an element. So the ingredient.
Yeah, you cannot have saltiness without salty elements.
Yes, exactly.
But the definition of saltiness is not constrained to the salty element, because it's being a predicate, it can actually,
Yeah, it can have any element to it. But if you say, for example, like you have a bowl of different saltiness stuff. If that in that bowl of saltiness, there is only one salty element that is in that bowl, then it would be an atom, because that predicate resolves into one item.
Yeah, but the bowl of saltiness can be the item. Like there's no the threshold is not defined ontologically. The threshold is defined logically. So if it coheres to talk about the saltiness of this whole dish, it's fine. Then you need to find an element that has salt in it, because that's the support of that atom. But it's the element that belongs the most to that thing. But it's not. There's nothing in this logic that counts as a point prior to the logical construction of the point as an atom. Correct. It goes back to the pointless.
Absolutely correct.
And the crazy thing is that I define the region with no reference to points. So it might be at any resolution, like at the grain, a salt, to the bowl of salt, to the whole restaurant, it doesn't matter. But once you define it through a logical coherence, you can recuperate the element. That's the postulate of materialism.
That's the postulate of that's the magic of postulates of materialism.
Yeah, it's saying, and I think that's good, because it shows that it's accepting a lot of nuance and kind of flexibility on the atomic component. But once you logically, and again, it's like a logical exploration of ontology. Once you logically explore the space and found a coherent set of atoms, you're guaranteed to have elements that fill that kind of structure, right?
Yeah.
So there's that scale relativity.
Exactly. That's why
built into it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that the scale relativity appears in the phenomenal component with the atomic component. I think from our perspective of being interested in that issue, that part acquires a big importance, and the loosiness of pointless and pointed topology is actually very relevant for us. Perhaps for other approaches, it might be less relevant. And this will become important for the points that we do have, which are points in the, well, there are actually the reintroduction of points, right? Which is in the chapter on points, because we're going to cover with a Boolean comb this nuanced space and actually try to extract relevant points, right? And at that point, the scale dependence, I think, comes back again, because points do depend on finding the right resolution for the right transcendental, right?
Mm-hmm. So it seems that there are three levels. Maybe it's a divergent from Dennis was talking about this example, but there seems to be not two levels, pointed and pointless. There are three levels. One is the complete heterogeneous world of phenomenal or phenomena or appearance, and then the level below it is the atomic level, and then the level below it is the power set.
Yeah, I think that's it. Like, in my opinion, that's how it goes.
So what's the phenomenon without the atomic there?
Well,
just the continuous functions, like the pointless topology.
It's just the lattice, not the. It's the ordering of the continuous functions, like in the lattice.
The example that we had is you feed a gradient of different shades and colors to a computer. That gradient of color is the lattice.
Yeah, I understood.
Right? And then below that, there is atomic logic. That
like you are localizing certain consistencies within this gradient, so you have the atoms coming out of this consistency.
Yeah, the magic for me is this, like, and it's amazing because it is a philosophy of language in a very weird sense, where you're using the separative power of language against itself, because you're investigating this nuanced lattice of infinite differentiation and saying, when language stops because it finds a coherent logical description, it actually stops because of extensional differences in the multiple, right? So it's tracking back, like if being an event was kind of dismissive of language because it doesn't create sets, it only extracts sets. Well, here that is actually very productive, because if it does extract sets, then the postulate of materialism says, well, there are sets, right?
Yeah,
so, I think here the discussion of compatibility now makes more sense, because if we take it three levels, then there is a level that that says once you get to the level of logical atoms, then logical atoms are supported by real atoms, which is the postulate of materialism. But then what is the glue that ties between the complete indifferent differentiation and the logical structure? And that glue is compatibility. So compatibility takes us from the complete gradient of differences into an atomic logic. So everything, you only come to an atom if those gradients are compatible with each other.
Yeah.
And then from atom to real atoms through postulates of materialism.
I find this, I really think that, I mean, I dreamt of this, like these three operators, localization, compatibility, and ontological order or atomic order, they are really weird because they're so central to the book. Like everything hinges on this. And it's so weird to get this sort of feel for a form of coherence that is not semantic in this, or not even syntactic, in the sense you're not really worried about how things go together, but simply the fact that you can get a perspective on something from some other things, but not all of them, right? Like, as I was saying, if you're seeing a movie which has Tom Cruise and you take Tom Cruise to be the atom, you did select something unique, but you cannot see the rest of the movie from that perspective. In fact, you can see more than you wished for, because you know he won't die, you know a bunch of stuff about the movie because it's Tom Cruise. But take a random actor, right? If you take the guy as the predicate of which is his proper name, you won't be able to see the rest of the space from that perspective, right? So the coherence of the space appears like the space sees itself if you choose the correct atom. So it's a sort of, it's not really a language in discussion of predicates because you're worried about meaning, semantic sense, and so on, but it's a sort of the perspectival power of language, right? What are the predicates that make things seen and that makes things see other things and be seen by them? It's really weird, like to think about these things in this way, I think. And the compatibility clause is, I mean, localization is strongly connected, but I think the compatibility part of it is the most profound, I think.
So it seems to me that if you go from the space of the lattice to the space of atomic components, there is a constraint that you need to apply, and that constraint is compatibility. So not all the ordering structure within the lattice can be recuperated within the atomic structure.
Yeah.
And in order from moving from the atomic structure to multiple, which is the discrete, you need to have the postulate of materialism. So actually then we have 3 levels. At the level that Dennis was talking about earlier, that there are, in everyday life, we are here. We are at this level, the level of lattice. And then we move down. So I think what would be didactic is to develop these 3, because Badiou kind of collapses. Do you see my pointer, mouse pointer?
No, I don't see the mouse pointer, but I see the 3.
Like, how do I?
Just draw on it. I think it's better to indicate through drawing.
I can't, I mean, I use the eraser now, I cannot draw.
You have to select there's another button.
Draw button?
Yeah, draw button.
Okay. So if at the level of everydayness, if you will, we are at this level, at the level of lattice. That's how the computer program sees the world, just gradients of differences of different things. But then that moves to this level, which says that what within this world coheres as an atom in this world. Not everything coheres as an atom. The move here has a constraint, and that is compatibility, which is this. And then the next level is, given these coheres as atoms, what comes as a multiple? So in order for something to be an atom, for something to be a multiple, there has to be a real being underneath that. So that is the postulate of materialism, that once something is an atom, there is a multiple for it. So that is covered by. So what I'm trying to say is this. I guess coming back to your original question, which I think now I have a better handle of it, is didactically, if Badiou had presented this in a 3-way structure like we are talking about, it would be, retroactively I'm saying, it would be much more understandable. Because he's kind of treating lattice and the atomic as logical, as one thing.
No, I don't think so exactly, because the atoms is precisely in between the transcendental and this very, very interesting equivalence between topology, localization, right? Compatibility, and a sort of algebraic ordering, right? And he actually gives us the equivalence between these three forms, right?
Understand, but like what I just said here, you can construct from what Badiou says, but he's not presenting it in this way, right?
Yeah, okay, yeah, I agree. Guys, I just need to, I look at the time now. I just think I should be a bit quicker with this, just so I can get to the actual theory of bodies. So, so the thing is, once you define compatibility, which is defined on the elements and the existence of another element, right? So it's already defined with a logical and ontological footing. You can define actually ordering between the support multiples, right? Here, this equation is very profound again, because the atom A being smaller than the atom B still is logical coherent, right? But again, we know these are supported by real elements. They are equivalent to saying that the existence of A is equal to the identity of A with B, right? So if in a world M we have A smaller than B, so the atom A is smaller than the atom B, this is just a shorthand that he uses, not the actual element, but the atom, right? We have A smaller than B and B smaller than A, then they prescribe the same atom for that world, right? He gives us these equivalences, which are kind of tie these things together. Real synthesis then tries to show, well, if you have an objective region of the support set for a given object, and if the elements, again, if they are compatible in pairs, right, then there exists an envelope E for that region, for that ontological relation that we define. So you can actually now reconstruct some element that is the envelope for a region of the support set itself. So again, you go a degree deeper from the passage of atoms to the multiple, right? You're saying, like, if the atoms cohere, in the sense that the analytic and the syntactic and the ontological clause are valid, then you can actually find elements in the support set that are the envelope for a certain ordering of those elements, right? Of those atom/elements. We get to the crazy transcendental functor, which is like not a regional synthesis like this, but the global synthesis, right? It kind of gives us the kind of completes the inverse move, right? If we remember the whole commuting diagram there, we actually are moving from T back to A. So it kind of completes the movement we were talking about. Well, if you have the transcendental structure in a certain way, if you have these elements compatible in pairs, and if you're therefore capable of real regional syntheses, you can actually have this functor that allows you to recuperate a sort of global coherence by mapping it back to the parts of this underlying set, right? I don't think I would be able to explain the details of this anyway. That's definitely the part of the book that remains for me something I would have a hard time explaining to somebody or presenting. So I'll just leave it at that, since we need to go a bit quicker. Again, then we get to the chapter on relations. The crucial part here is the idea of the inexistent, right? We know that Badiou has a very kind of poor place reserved for relations, a very conservative theory of relations, which now I think it's actually a very good idea, but I think that one of the big tensions or big important underlying ideas in the greater logic is the distinction between composition and relation, right? In our meeting on Karatani and Badiou, I even joked, but it's not that much of a joke. I think it's actually what it is. Like, Marx makes the distinction between forces of production and relations of production, right? Forces of production, they create the world through technology, labor, so on and so forth. Where relations of production are actually the relations that organize those things. I think composition of objects and relations between objects is kind of like that. Relations are more like extrinsic distributive problems, whereas composition is about generative transformation and so on.
Yeah, I will just add one point that relations are also objects. So
Yeah, that's crucial. Yeah. Yeah. So actually, the right definition would be, I think it's on two levels, right? Relations are conservative, but they actually only exist if they are themselves objects. So a relation needs to appear as an object, right?
Yeah, and yeah, so if you want to study a relation, you actually have to go further. Like you have to go into their parts, I think,
Yeah.
and study the like you said, the forces of production underlying the components of that relation.
So we know that he presents first this discussion on the inaccessible cardinality of the world. He proves this, or he suggests this, by looking at two properties of worldly logic, which is dissemination, right? So if a multiple belongs to a world and something belongs to that multiple, that something also belongs to the world. So everything that is included in a multiple is also in a world. So everything that belongs to a multiple also belongs to the world, and vice versa. If a multiple belongs to the world, the power set of that multiple also belongs to the world. This comes back later on in a second postulate of materialism, right? So he gives us a definition of relations, which we saw: preserve existence and preserve localization, doesn't diminish the identity of the things that it relates, preserves compatibility. Again, this is crucial for him. And then he talks about the universal exposition of relations, which is, I find it interesting because it allows us to distinguish between, let's say, connections, which are, let's say, linkages between objects that don't appear, right? And actual relations, which are relations that have actually an object that exposes the relation for the world, right? So there is a distinction between, let's say, unseen connections, which is something you can make from your experience or whatever, and actual relations, which actually concern relations that appear, right? So it's not relation for you. It's not a connection for you. It's actually connections in the world, right? I think for our interest in Marxism, this is actually quite important. So he gives the definition of the relations being universally exposed. The way they understood how this connects with the inaccessible cardinality is because for every relation, for every two objects there, you can always construct a third object. Like this third object that exposes the relation is always inside the world because the world has an inaccessible cardinality. That's how I understand why the thesis is formulated in that way. Like if the world is logically complete, then all relations are universally exposed.
Which again, it's like all relations are objects.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can say why, and I think that this is kind of the dissemination and totalization are pretty much saying this, right? Fuck, go back. Why is this so slow all of a sudden?
And then also relations between relations are objects. And relations, like you can keep going higher.
Okay, let me just, we're almost there. Okay, so universal exposition of relations. Then the last thing in the chapter is the inexistent, which for some reason my computer just made inexistent as well.
This is the perfect slide for the perfect area to show the inexistent.
My computer is just going a bit crazy, guys. Just one second. Yeah, so the inexistent, so for every object, the function, the atom of X equaling mu prescribes an atom. So that's pretty much the definition, right? For every object, there is one atom which is minimal, has minimal existence. So absolutely doesn't belong, right? It is which is a weird formula because it's saying it is supported in the multiple, right? It is an atom, but its belonging value is mu, it's 0. So it doesn't appear. So it's a very nice formula for the idea of something that belongs but doesn't appear, right? Which in Being an Event was this idea of it's presented but not represented, right? And then he gives us this definition for it. This null A is the element of A which supports the real atom which has mu as its value, right? And we have that anything connected, the identity of anything with this atom will have to be mu as well. So we get to the theory of points that Caron presented. No, actually we get to the theory of site, right? That Reza presented. Here is interesting. We need this just because isolates require sites and points connect to the eventual trace. So we need to have a good idea of what these things mean to get through these things. So sites are objects where for some reason the support set belongs to itself, right? And we try to think about this in terms of an idea of form and matter distinction. And I'll just go really quickly through this because we already discussed this with recently with Reza, right? The only thing I wanted to point out a bit is that there is actually a discussion on affection, what it means for something to really affect something else, right? So given an object and two elements of the support set, X really affects Y if the dependence of the existence, so the existence of X implies the existence of Y has maximal value, right? So he actually goes through this sort of definition of affection, right? Which is almost like his theory of causation, but defined in a more Spinozian sense of something that affects something else, right? So given an object, something affects something else. So one component or a part of an object affects another part, right? If the existence of one implies the existence of the other, if that implication has a maximal degree of existence, right? Or maximal degree of appearance.
Which is always true if the existence is a smaller degree, right?
Yeah.
X has a smaller degree than Y, then it will always give a maximal dependence.
Yeah, because this is the something false implying something true, right?
Yeah.
If existence of X is null, then that is maximal.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just did our little drawing there. So the 4 forms of change, we have becoming as the general category of modifications, right? Where, for example, ID X of Y in moment 1 equals, I don't know, P, and then ID X of Y equals Q. There's a modification, right? Nothing, when we talked about a phenomena, it seemed like we were defining it spatially, right? The relation between X and its identity to every other element made it seem like it's a spatial definition, but it could perfectly be a temporal one. Like it could include temporal differentiation for that consideration, and that would be just the becoming of the object, right? So modifications is all those changes in the transcendental indexing that don't, in the case that the very support set does not appear in the object, whereas a site is the case where it does appear because it belongs to itself, right? Then affect is where the existence of that support set itself doesn't have maximal value, and singularity is the case where it does have maximal value. Then you get a weak singularity when the dependence structure, the affectation structure is such that it only causes things, the maximality of affectation is only in the case where the second term was already maximal, which is what Dennis was mentioning, right? So the site appears, but the only things that you can say that it affects are things that were already true. So it's actually for every X that is maximal, for the existence of everything that was already maximal to begin with. So it's a singularity. So let's say the matter, the formless aspect of that situation does appear to, it does participate in the situation, but it participates just to, let's say, reinstate things that were already maximal to begin with, right? Whereas the event is defined when that support set actually affects the inexistent, and that dependence has a maximal value, right? So this is the big thing, right? And you can see that in this definition here, it's nice because you have the totality of the support set with its minimal, like it's the ontological maxima with the logical minima in an implicative structure, right? So it's not like, oh, something belongs to itself. It's more sophisticated than that. I find this formula actually quite nice. Anyway, with this, we can now get to points. And I think that it's good to give a kind of, spend like a bit of minutes here because we didn't really discuss the formal part last time very much. So Badiou gives a definition of points as a surjective homomorphism from the transcendental to a Boolean transcendental of only two values, right?
This is very nice. This is very nice writing.
Thank
Did
you
you
very
say
much.
that you wrote with pen?
Yes, I practiced.
Okay.
There was a lot of erasing and rewriting, I can tell you that. So surjective means that all degrees in the codomain are affected, right? Dennis hammered this point down in our heads many times. Homomorphism means that it preserves conjunctions and envelopes. Degrees in the codomain are affected, meaning that there is one P. So in this function from T to T0, there is one P that was mapped to 1 and one P that was mapped to 0. So both values of the transcendental are affected, right? So surjective and homomorphism, because if the conjunction is preserved, right, and the envelope as well. So the mapping of a conjunction equals the mapping of one term with the new conjunction with the other term. And the mapping of the envelope is also the new envelope of the mapping of the terms being enveloped in the codomain, right? One thing that I think, again, is where the resolution scaling aspect comes in that we might downplay because it's a very small comment. But I think in our case, might be a relevant point to focus on, is that he says that there must be a kinship between the transcendental and the new Boolean transcendental. Depending on the T in question, this is just a sentence that he actually says, I'm just quoting him here. Depending on the transcendental in question, there might be many, few, or non-functions that are conjunction and envelope preserving. So it depends on the transcendental that you might find these functions. It's not coming from nowhere, right? That you might find a way to map this one thing to the other actually depends on the quality of the transcendental, right? Not only because it must preserve its structure, right? It's not defined regardless of the structure of the transcendental. But in the actual chapter, I found it important that he shows that these functions, I think that they have a connection with the idea of the phenomenal component, you know, in the sense that you need to find a way to frame things in such a way that you can then map it into a yes or no. It's not like anything maps to a yes or no or none. There are ways that do and ways that don't. So you might have to find, for example, the right resolution to do it. So there's a whole art, like I think that this idea of kinship is important because there's a whole art of finding the right perspective from which the yes or no question is formulatable, right? Then he does this thing where he gives us the axiom of an interior. Basically, how do you construct a topological space, right? It basically concerns how to define interiority. I wish we had some time to spend on this in Lazarus, because this is pretty much a condition that will guarantee that there is such a thing as the interiority of a subjective process. And then after he defined what a topological space is through this interior function, he shows that given a transcendental and a set of point functions like this, if you take now the positivations, so the set of positive points, right? So the set P such that these point functions actually had positive value. and you ask the question of how is this positivation subset included in the set of all points, right? So you have a bunch of negative and positive decision points, and you ask the question, what is the relation of that positivation subset? And he shows that the axioms of the interior are actually respected by the positivation subset, right? So the set of all points actually forms a topology. It has an interior that is organized like a topological space. So at this point here, which I found, again, very profound, and it's for no wonder that it's using a result from this sort of special equivalence between logic, ordering, and topology, right? Which seems to be one of the big kind of weapons of the book. To be able to define these points is to define a space, right? That has interior coherence, right? We did discuss the isolates a bit. He shows that it is possible that there is worlds without points, right? He makes a distinction between the worlds without points and worlds that have as many points as degrees, which is also possible, but we get to this, the theory of bodies, we can discuss this a bit more. So with all of this, which is pretty much a recap of everything we've seen, we can finally discuss the bodies, which is actually a very, very short chapter. If you go to the statements at the end of the book and you read the chapter on points and the chapters on bodies, they're like 5 statements each. And the greater logic has like 40 statements. Oh my God, where are we? Yes, we're here.
Just wanted to mention that I have time till the top of the hour.
Okay, I think it's enough to cover this. So theory of bodies, and now we can understand this a bit better. And I didn't want to miss the fact that we're entering a chapter that has as a subtitle, we know why a body exists, what it can and cannot do. So we better be able to answer these 3 questions once we're over. And now we can also understand the conditions for the first concept, which is incorporation. And he says, given a world, we know what it is, and a transcendental, and an object, which is a site, again, its referent set appears in the object, where through an event, an inexistent has acquired maximal intensity, we will call an eventual trace. So he rewrites the inexistent as an eventual trace in the case that its existence has acquired maximal value, right? So in such conditions, the elements of the object can entertain a new relation to the trace, to this inexistent that now has maximal value, right? So if previously in the chapter on relations, we saw that the identity of X with the inexistent is always mu, because the existence of the inexistent has mu for a value. Once the inexistent becomes an eventual trace, we know that the identity of it with any other element is smaller or equal to the conjunction of their existences. In given, sorry, again, it's stuck. But given that the inexistent now has the existence of the trace has maximal value, the identity of the eventual trace to any other element is smaller or equal to the existence of that element, right? The other element will define, let's say, how low is the common boundary, their common conjunction. Because if this is a maximal value, right? The conjunction of P with M is actually given by P. So this now is the existence of the other element that will give us, let's say, the degree of their identity, since we know the eventual trace has maximal value. So we will say that this element X incorporates into the eventual present, which is defined in book 1. And I hope that in the next meeting, we get to talk about the terms from the first book in the light of everything we're talking here. But we'll say that X incorporates into the eventual present, which actually he doesn't define this term, but I have the impression that it's pretty much the same as the set of all points, right? He uses this, actually the same, he defines a set of points like this, right? Sorry, the set of functions like this. so it seems like the eventual presence might just be formally defined as a set of all points, both positive and negative. So we say that X incorporates in the exact case that the identity of X and the trace is equal to the existence of X and not equal or smaller than. Right. So when you get this equivalence in their transcendental identity, we will say that X has been incorporated. And the reason for this is that given the atomic logic, we can actually tell that if the identity of X and the trace is the value of the existence of X, we can say that X is smaller than the trace in the ontological atomic coherence. And if, again, if the elements are all compatible, all the elements that are incorporated are compatible with one another, I'm sorry, this actually allows us to deduce this, right? If you can define an ontological order on the elements that have a relation to a trace, you can define that they are compatible with one another, right? Because one of the definitions there is that if X is smaller than E and Y is smaller than E, then X is compatible with Y. Right? So if I found a way that X and E equals the existence of X, and I also found that the existence of Y and the trace is the existence of Y, then I can define this and I can define this. And if I can define these two things, I can tell them that they're compatible in pairs. And we know that if they're compatible in pairs, I can define a real synthesis on the point, on the elements that are connected to the inexistent, right? Or to the eventual trace. So from this sort of coherence in ordering structure, which is a sort of recasting of the atomic logic on the eventual trace, we're now coming close to the point where we can actually construct something with these connections, right? So the body, which we call C of E, right? C, the body of the eventual trace, it's localized, it's connected to the eventual trace. So a body where E is the inexistent maximal for a given object A, where A belongs to itself, meaning A is a site, is a set of elements X of the object A, such that they conform to that equivalence in the identity function. And therefore, that they are smaller, ontologically smaller than the eventual trace.
I have a question here, which is, earlier, didn't we say that the event makes it so that all of the other elements in the object obey this condition, are less than the trace? Like, are there elements in the object that don't obey this?
Yeah, but look, I think that it's not the case that we're not defining. Yes, I think there are, because, for example, if I have this, right? This is the pointless version, right? I don't know, I cannot really define extensionally where these things are. So I cannot guarantee that because this is strict ordering, right?
Okay, so one is equals.
Yeah, that's the crucial clause. Yeah, the crucial clause is the equivalence, right? It's not smaller or equal. It's just actually equal.
Okay, I see.
Right, so it's only the equality that allows you to make this inference here. Because this is defined on the multiple, right? This is defined on the transcendental.
Okay. So yeah, I think I didn't catch the relation changed from.
Yeah, I should stress this a bit clearer here, but it's here. Look. See, only if it's equal, and the transcendental identity, given the atomic logic of strict order, then is defined in the atomic ordering from the book on the object. It's not, this is not the lattice ordering. This is actually back on the strict extensional one, right?
I see. Okay.
Yeah,
I guess it's tricky though, because the existence of something, the existence of the trace is maximal now. But I guess it's not maximal for everybody. Like, because if it is maximal, then isn't it true that the identity of anything with it is the existence of the other thing? Like, identity of A with something that is maximal is just always the existence of A. And that's just the definition of a maximal existence. So I guess I'm missing, like...
Yeah, I think that this connects us. That's why I put this in blue, because I think this depends on the definition of ontological order, because this is given, right? So, which is what you're saying, right?
Okay. So that's not the definition. Okay, sorry. I think, yeah, now I got it. So just because something is maximal doesn't mean we can say the identity of something else with it is equal to
yeah,
the first
you can't.
thing.
Yeah, that's a constraint. It cannot be more than that, right? So the identity, like, this is the general formula, right? The identity of something with something else is actually translatable as the conjunction of their existences, right?
Right.
Knowing that this is maximal, we know that this term defines the upper bound
Right.
of the conjunction, right? At most, it will be E of X, but it can be less than that.
Right. So it's actually, we have an upper bound.
At most, it can be
of E of X.
At most, I mean, if they are equal, it will be E of epsilon, right?
Yeah.
If this is maximal, yeah.
Yeah.
So
we're talking about in general case.
In the general case, when we don't know what it is, given that we're making the conjunction of something, a value P with a value M is a value P, but at most, it might be less than P. That's okay, right?
No. It cannot be less than P.
Yes.
No, conjunction of P with maximum value is always P, is equal to P.
No, yeah, you're right. But I mean, the identity is not necessarily, I think this yellow, the thing you wrote on here is in terms of degrees.
Yes.
In which case it is an equal sign. But in terms of identity, it is a less than or equal to.
Well,
which is slightly different. It means the identity doesn't have to be the same as the existence.
Yes, it's constrained by it. Yeah, the value of this is not given yet. Like, this is, let's say, ID of X and E is a value X. Sorry, it's a value, let's use some other, right? It's something we don't know, it's R. But we know that R needs to be at most the value of this.
This is not less than or equal sign. IDX and E is equal EX conjunction with E epsilon. What is this less than is E of X itself.
No, it's less than or equal to. This you
well,
mean
IDX and epsilon is less than or equal to EX. Right?
It follows from this because the trace is maximal.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is the transcendental formula is that ID of something with something else is always less than or equal to existence of that something.
Yeah, the ID of X and Y is always smaller or equal to the existence of X conjunction with the existence of Y. I think this is called a triangular inequality, right? Because you can rewrite this like this.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And you want to say that this value here constrains this value here. So let's call this R. R needs to be smaller or equal to this 2. Meaning if we know this is M and this is P, right?
Yeah,
we can reduce this to this, right?
Yeah, it's clear to me now. I think, it's interesting because the laws of the transcendental prescribe an upper bound to identity in this form. And
Yeah.
then now we're saying incorporation is prescribing the lower bound as well.
Yes.
Which is saying like raising the lower bound to the upper bound to meet at a certain point, right?
Yeah, because this means that you're entangling the actual existence of the element with the value of their relation, right? You're not
right.
You're on the ballpark of it. That's why it's incorporated. It's actually very profound. Like I found it stupid. Like, oh, okay, but who gives a shit? It's equivalent and not like up to, you know? But it's actually saying that you're implicating the value of that existence, right? So this identity becomes equal to the value of this.
Yeah, it's like saying something happens in the world, I could have nothing in relation to it, right? If like even if it's maximal existence, I don't have anything to do with it. That can still be possible in a world. But to say I'm incorporated into it means my very existence in the world is dependent on it in a way.
Yeah. And this is the formula in the atomic logic. If I know that the ID of X with A is the same as X with X, means that X was bounded by A. So you can actually translate this into this term. This term becomes, right? Because as you say, like once we move, we knew that the conjunction was gave us an upper bound, but the value could be below of that R, right? Once we brought it to the very existence of the element, we can now know that this point is actually smaller than A. So we can actually define this, right? So you can actually move to this more ontological ordering. So incorporation, exactly as you said, is a way of defining implication of existence, very subtly, in fact, right? So, and this brings us to the body definition that I gave, right? And I think that, again, it mobilizes the whole thing with atomic logic because this body, right, is equal to the set of elements, X, of the reference set, such that they have this implicative structure. So we know that all these elements, X, are such that they are smaller than the trace. They're strictly smaller, right? Strictly ordered in this way. And this condition is actually very strong because once we know this, right, we know something about their relation. We know they are compatible. And if we know they are compatible as per the atomic logic, we know we can construct a real synthesis, right? We can talk about the space, the region B of the body that can have its own envelope, right? It's the trickiest part of the book, I think, the real synthesis in the frontier, right? But that's what we get if we get all these conditions in play.
Yeah, I think it becomes clear in a lattice if you think of like real synthesis means there's a common element that they join at in the lattice.
Yeah, but I think that's synthesis, right? The problem is that once you have the lattice structure, right? Let's say something like this. Just to have a lattice with some structure, right? This is the lattice. This is synthesis, right? To find, for example, that this is the common here, right? The envelope. But the problem is that we are not defining synthesis on the lattice. We're defining synthesis on the multiple. That's why it's real synthesis. It's synthesis between the support sets of the atoms, right? Like that's the core of the atomic logic. You moved from the transcendental lattice to the atoms. They had some inner structure, some inner coherence that allows us to talk about the support set. And now we're defining the synthesis on the support set, not the synthesis on the transcendental.
Yeah, but that is what the transcendental sheaf does, I think.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
the impact of that. Yeah, it projects the lattice structure onto the support sets. think that's the whole projective coherence.
Yeah,
thing,
yeah, exactly. So we're actually exploring that realm, right? We're not defining things on the transcendental, we're defining things on the multiple. And I think that this is now we're getting to the point of why the postulate of materialism is so important, right? Because if we move from A to T, and that's where we are at, right? Bodies are actually, let's say, new coherences at this level. So we can only move from here to a new T, right? But because there is the postulate of materialism, what we're actually doing is like this. We move from here to here. Then with atomic logic, we're starting to zigzag here. And then from here, we're moving to a new T. Because it's actually the synthesis that can happen at this level, right? That allows us to construct something that escapes this transcendental. It's not like a virtual surplus or something like this. It's through the multiple, like synthesis on the actual elements, right? That's why the matter form distinction is so useful, because it's not a matter of like invention for Badiou. It's not like, you have some formal means, some structure, and then you come up with some new structure. It's like when you extract structure from matter, formless matter, right? So it's impossible to talk about the theory of events and bodies and so on without the bypassing or the detour through the matter that had no form in that world. You cannot go from formed space in a world to a new form in a new world, right? If you do that, chances are that they're actually compatible, because there will be a transformation from one form to the other, right? The rupture comes from the fact that you're moving from logical coherence in a world back onto the projection onto the multiple and extracting something from the multiple that has no place in the transcendental and bringing it back to form, right? That's also why it merits the name of a body. It's not like it's absolutely materialistic. There is no real change for Badiou without the material support that exceeds the transcendental.
Okay, yeah, I didn't catch this when I read this part. So the body is on the level of the support sets. It's it's a configuration of support sets.
Yeah,
I see.
So when we talk about synthesis here, when we talk about real order here, we're talking about definitions on the multiple, not definitions on the lattice, right? All of this presupposes that we can project the lattice back onto the multiple.
That's why he calls it an object.
So now that we know how to define a body in this way, right? It's a set of all elements that have been shown to be, their existence is implicated in the trace. So they become, let's say, a point for the trace, right? And that therefore they are smaller than the eventual trace in this ontological order. We can start defining a synthesis of these elements that are compatible, right? So given that the elements of the body are compatible, it follows that they admit a real synthesis. We know as per atomic logic. So an envelope that operates directly on the support set. So he calls S of C, so the synthesis of the body, the element that serves as the envelope for the body. So this element is not an element of the lattice, it's an element of the support set. And we know from the localization and the compatibility and the ordering that with those three conditions, you can actually define syntheses. This is the famous, and by famous, I mean incomprehensible lemma phi. I don't know if that's letter phi. I never know the Greek letter, but
Phi.
Thank you. Please help me with that, Reza, because I always forget. So as per that lemma, and later through the transcendental functor, we know that we can define syntheses directly on the multiple through the lattice, right? So S is the element that serves as the envelope for the body. It prescribes a real atom such that that real atom is the envelope of all the identities of C, which is an element of the body, and X, right? So given the definition of the trace, which is maximal, we know that it belongs to the body. And thus for every X, such that X belongs to the body, we know that either it's smaller than E or it's equal to E. Therefore, E is the element that is the transcendental, is the corporeal synthesis, right? Because if it is the atom that functions as the envelope for all the elements in the body, we know the trace fills that prescription. So we had the minimal, right? It moved to a trace. Then we use the trace, its identity to other things, to define a set of elements that fulfill this condition. We defined a set that contains all elements that fill this condition, right? So all x's such that this condition here is valid. And now we define the upper bound, the envelope, the ontological envelope, the real synthesis of this. And we show that the real synthesis of this is E itself, so far as this holds, right? This and this. If these two things hold, then E equals the real synthesis of the body. So you could say, well done, Badiou. This is the proof that the possibility of a body, because the eventual trace, so the very thing that had no form but now has maximal intensity of existence, it will serve as the ontological guarantee of the inner logical coherence of this thing that, from the standpoint of the transcendental, doesn't have any degree of existence at all. It's minimal, right? Because the identity of anything with the inexistent is nil. But this is where I think he gets pragmatic, like a sort of transcendental pragmatism or Platonic pragmatism or some crazy thing. Because for him, this is not enough, right? So he starts defining organs and efficacious parts. So given an element of the body, we will say that that element affirms a point, and this brings the theory of point in, if the phi function of that existence is maximal, right? So as I was saying, like we defined, we made this passage, right? We showed that we can incorporate things whose existence starts to define a certain boundary for the trace. We show that there is a set of all these x's here, right? And we've shown that E is the real synthesis for this, but none of these implied points, right? Up to this level. And now he says, well, you know that this coheres, but now let's see if it's efficacious, like if it does something, if it treats something in the world, right? And so he says now, we will say that something in this body, so let's call this body like CE. We know that it has the envelope, and we know that it has other elements like X and Y, elements which are smaller than E, and E is the envelope for them, epsilon is the envelope for them. But now we will call them efficacious parts if we can define that for the existence of this, the mapping of this through the surjective homomorphism to the Boolean transcendental, it gives us a positive value. Right? Now, the value of this, the existence of E, which is maximal, it gives us, through this point, also maximal value. So this is kind of like, in Portuguese, you say raining on the wet, like when something's kind of redundant, you know, like sure that the eventual trace maps onto a positive, like that's kids play, right? That the inexistent has maximal existence. Yeah. What's new? Actually, that's what's new. But in fact, it doesn't tell you that much. It's not that novel to begin with, right? So you start having a definition of efficacy, which is interestingly based on the distancing from the trace. So we're interested to define efficacy in saying that, yes, the epsilon is maximal, and therefore for every point function, its mapping of the trace to the Boolean transcendental will be 1, right? but we are interested, so it's kind of an indifferent efficacy, he says, the efficacy of the trace itself. It doesn't really matter what it is treating. It's always, or what point you're treating, what function you define. It's always maximal for it, right? Because it's defined by having the maximal value. So what's an efficacious part is the capacity for you to define for other parts that are not the synthetic part, which is E of the body, of points that are positive, right? So you don't want simply E to be giving you 1, but the question is, we know that E is bigger than X. What about points that the existence of X equal 1? So smaller regions that equal to 1, right? That map as belonging, or map as giving us a positive value. So that's why I said that he's not happy about simply defining the body by its synthetic point. He wants, that's how we get to the idea of organs, right? Because it may be the case that for certain points, only the eventual trace affirms it. Only the eventual trace obtains a positive value in this mapping, in the homomorphism, right? And in these cases, the efficacious part, which he calls like this, so it's the part of the body that treats the point that you define. That in some cases, only the body itself, right? Only the trace treats it positively. So it's like you need the envelope of the whole body to treat the point. So the point and the organ are kind of equalized, and he calls this inorganic or dispersed bodies, because there is no part of it which is efficacious. Like there is no region of the body that has a capacity. So we get to the definition of organs, which is the opposite case. When it's not inorganic, you actually can define, right? Given that the elements EX of the body, or of the efficacious part, right? The part of a body that treats a point, are necessarily compatible in pairs, we can define an envelope for the support set of a given efficacious part, right? So this will be an element E for the point phi, so a trace for the point. So it's a relative, more localized synthesis, which is then called an organ. So we can kind of imagine like this, right? You have a body with a trace. The trace is kind of the synthesis of all X's and Y. But you might also have, for a certain number of X's, an envelope that is more localized, right? So E of phi, which for a given function phi, this treats that function without direct references to the envelope, to the global synthesis or the corporeal synthesis, right? So that's how you start to partition the body into efficacious parts that treat certain points.
Yeah, well, I will say here that I think the trace belongs to every efficacious part.
The trace yeah. Right, but I think the definition is this, right? For every X, there is a element which is distinct from the trace, right? So this condition here, we want the synthetic region for a given point to be distinct from the eventual trace itself. So it's smaller than the eventual trace. It belongs to eventual trace, but the eventual trace doesn't belong to it, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because the point maps things to 1 or 0. It must map the trace to 1.
Yes.
All points map the trace to 1. So the trace treats all points.
Yeah, that's why it's an indifferent efficacy, right?
Yeah, it's indifferent.
Not singular. Yeah. There's no singularity of the trace's relation to the point.
I see. So just Badiou is defining here the organ as everything that affirms the point minus the trace.
Yeah.
Like cutting the trace off.
Yeah, I think so. So I think the point is that from the standpoint of the trace, you don't distinguish, let's say, if you have a smaller, like this region here of points has an envelope E epsilon line, right? Which also treats positively. Like you can always refer this back to the general synthesis of the body, right? For example, you can say that the army won the battle. That will be a true statement, right? But was the army as the body, or was actually a region of the army? Like that's a more specific
battalion.
Thing. Yeah, the battalion actually won the war, like, or made the move, right?
Like
you can singularize it further.
In the Alexander, that was the left battalion that then won the war.
Yeah. Or for example, in the Black Panthers, like, sure, you can talk about the Black Panthers as having caused some change, but if you look at the actual existence of the Black Panthers, it was divided into, for example, the local communal services, the guerrilla urban soldiers, like that's actually distinct. But how is it distinct? It's distinct because it treats different points. And of course, you can refer to the general envelope of all of that. But what's special is that there's actually envelopes that single out those organs, right? That efficacy for that certain number of points, right? I'm not sure if that helped.
Yeah, I'm thinking also the Webern and Berg, the example that Karan used is in serial music, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, my question is, in this case, the relation between the local envelope to the trace is, how is it maintained? Like, because in this case, it is maintained by having that local element, which is X, in that diagram you wrote, belongs to C. So in that case, that envelope actually also belongs to C, which is less than epsilon. Okay.
Yeah, what I was going to say is that from this first statements, actually, this is inverted, right? We know that there is an eventual trace. We know that by the relations of the eventual trace with other elements, we can get a set of elements that fulfill that condition that we described above, called incorporation, right?
That's the body, yes.
Yeah, once we have the body, we know that we have a consistency in it, which is defined by this thing and its possibility of synthesis, right? Defining some envelope. We know that this envelope at first is called the synthesis of the body itself, right? But what he says is that, okay, stop here. You define the consistency, but you haven't defined the capacity. And I think that there is such a, I really want us to go into this next time, because I think this is very profound. What is the definition of capacity for Badiou? Capacity is kind of like the possibility of taking something from below the transcendental and imposing it on the situation, right? So now the capacity comes the points into play, and you want to see if something can affect something else. But the problem is that from that different perspective, this is from the consistency form side. Now we're looking at the cause side. Can it cause things, right? Can it affect things?
Well, that's the relation to the theory of points.
Yeah, and now we come to points, and then the question that what we see is that we are doing something inverted, because here in the consistency side, finding the trace to be the global envelope of the body is like a very good news. But from the standpoint of points, only having the trace as that which guarantees the points being treated is actually very bad news. Because for him, since the trace is by definition maximal, the fact that for every function, for every point, the trace gives you maximal, it's actually redundant. It's like saying revolution is revolutionary, equality is equalizing. Yeah, fine, but I don't want to see that the declaration is a declaration. or the declaration is new. I want to see what things under this declaration can cause things, right? So you want to move down from the eventual trace further away from it. You want to see if the axes that are inside this region called SC, this, the corporeal synthesis, which has E for its envelope, what axes inside of it are capable of themselves treating something, right? That's why I call it pragmatic. Like there is a sort of disenchantment or care with not being too in love with the eventual trace, right? That's why in the corporeal possibilities that he talks about for a point, if you have here, if you have a body, right? So if you have a body, C of E, which has the eventual trace inside of it, but has no efficacious part, meaning there is no part that I can define for X, something like this, right? The point is not held. Being held by the eventual trace doesn't guarantee the holding of any point, right? Let's say that the statement slaves want to go home is new. Yeah, that's kind of the point, right? That's what it is. That you can do things new in the world because of that statement, that's what's at stake, right? But that's not enough. So then there comes a second condition, which is I can have a body, I can have a trace, and I can have a set of axes that treat points, but still their envelope is E itself. So what gives coherence to this region is E itself. It's as Dennis was saying, it is the synthesis of the points in general. So I still can only talk about the body. I can still only talk about the actions of the body by referring to the body itself, not to parts of the body. So the body exists, but there's nothing exists in the body, something like this, right? For Badiou, points are not held in this way. Nothing is treated, right? So it's not enough to have an eventual trace and to have a set of X that are smaller than the eventual trace, but the synthesis of the axis needs to be smaller than E. So there is an organ
particular point
for a particular point. Yeah. So the organ synthesizes the part, right? So the real synthesis of the part is actually smaller than the trace. That's for him what it means to hold a point, right? To treat the point.
Yeah, because it fits in the definition of envelope. This is the smallest element that is bigger than all.
Yeah, I think that in the whole book, you should really not underestimate these niceties of, you know, the upper less value or the smaller upper value, this sort of double qualifications. That's what gives something singularity, right?
Mm-hmm.
To prove that something is smaller than something is easy. To prove that is the largest, smallest something, that's what gives it a singular value, right?
So the efficacy is defined as the synthesis, as the envelope of particular region or sub-region of the body that treats a certain point positively.
Mm-hmm. Such that the envelope is the closest to the point being treated and not the global envelope of the body.
Right. Because that's the definition of envelope. The envelope that synthesizes the region of the body that treats a point positively.
Yes, I think it's, yeah, exactly. So just to conclude, so this is pretty much...
So efficacy in this case is the ability to treat a point positively.
Yes.
Now, the ability to treat a point positively, there may be points that the smallest region, the envelope of the region would be the trace itself, right? I mean, there might be a point that there might be a point that that the entire body turns that treats that point positively. In that case, for
That's
that
all
particular,
points. That's all points.
That's, well, no, smallest epsilon, right? So all points
are held by the trace.
Trace treats all points positively, but trace is not the envelope.
Yeah.
For that region, but there may be a point that the trace is the envelope, which means that the entire body treats that point positively. But organ is what the synthesis of a part of the body whose envelope treats that point positively. That in that case, so what I'm trying to say is that epsilon of phi could be less than or equal than epsilon itself. So there may be a point that epsilon is the envelope.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So this is the definition, right, of the envelope of certain axes that their existence treats the point, right? And I think that this would be a formula that's worth pondering about, because it has a bunch of elements that define a sort of pragmatic militancy for Badiou, I think, because you have here a sort of distinction between this envelope and the trace. So there is a distance from the trace that is maintained, right? In the definition of point, there is a sort of art of finding the right resolution where a point can be formulated, right? Because as we know, this here implies finding the right question, right? In a certain sense. It's not for every question that it has kinship with the transcendental. It's not every question that will, again, it goes back to the atomic logic. It's not every question that will preserve conjunctions and envelopes in their answer, right? So this thing here this is actually that function that like this, right? It's a homomorphism. So to find a point is also to find a point is also to find a question that is both let's say gonna relate you to something that is incorporated, so something that will absorb a bit of that informed matter of the site, but also something that will relate to the transcendental. It has some kinship with it. So there is some artfulness into this, right? To formulate a point is not simply to ask a stupid question and wait for yes or no. Is to find those questions or those kind of dramatic instances where you're put into a sort of collusion between there is the how do you call it, the timbre of the saxophone, and there is the harmonic structure. What is the question that binds the existence of things that have timbre to the harmonic problem of jazz music, right? Not every question will do this, and not for every transcendental you'll be able to find it. That's also why I think that not every event can lead to points, because some, for example, in the world of some certain sort of music, the emergence of the voice timbre of some singer might not connect with anything in that world of music, right?
That's what isolates are for. I mean, there has to be an isolate in the transcendental in order for the question that pertains to a point to exist.
Yeah,
if
so
there's no isolate.
Yeah, exactly. So incorporation is at stake. So you're looking for the synthesis, which is not the eventual trace, for questions that have this artful quality of mixing the formulas of the inexistent with the kinship with the transcendental, and that apply to the existence of things, right? All of this brings together many elements into the idea of efficacy, right? If you read about efficacy from different sources, like Philippe Julien and other guys who discuss what efficacy is, like from, for example, Chinese tradition of this sort of concept, there's a lot of resonance with what it means to be efficacious, right? to navigate the language of a certain world or the propensity of a certain world, at the same time that you exploit it in order to force something which doesn't belong there. But at the same time, you're not trying to do this in a maximal way as a sort of spectacle, right? So I think that this condition here is like an anti-spectacle condition. This thing here is interesting in this combination of you're trying to preserve something of the transcendental at the same time that you're trying to exploit the connection between the eventual trace and some other element, right? And here is also the force of consistency, because you're looking for a Boolean classical division of the situation, right? So
actually, the force of consistency is on the envelope side.
Yeah, this is ontological, but I mean there's logical consistency, because this is either 1 or 0, right?
That's a condition for treating it positively, defining an inner space.
Yes, okay. I don't think it's just a different definition. I just mean like you're exploiting classical negation, right? You're not formulating questions to get a kind of answer. You're getting a yes or no answer, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, it's amazing how much stuff actually is at play in this small formula, right? And I find it very profound that he proves it quite nicely that, look, man, if only the eventual trace is the synthetic point. So if only the appearance of the timbre of the voice or the timbre of the saxophone in that particular song that Ornette Coleman played is the thing that makes you see the world different. Like, if that thing doesn't connect to other things that can now be treated themselves as the region in the world, nothing happened, right? So, and that's why in this, we have this type of worlds here. So first is just worlds where there is no isolate, right? Where there is no I such that the I is different from mu, but for any j is smaller than I. You know, if j is smaller than I, then it is mu. So there's nothing between the isolate and the minimal value, right? So he calls worlds without isolate atonic worlds. He calls worlds where the transcendental, so the existence of the site is never maximal. So it might be the case that this singularity, this formless matter comes to appear. For example, you do take a kind of contemplative interest in the singular texture of the world, but that never gets to change anything. That's a stable world, right? Then you can also go wrong in events do happen, but there's never an X whose existence is equal to their identity to the trace. So there's no incorporation. That's an inconsequential world. So something does happen, it appears maximally, this sort of timbre of the saxophone, but nothing gets incorporated into it, right? There is no other wrong note or note played wrong in the saxophone that becomes a right note from the standpoint of its connection with that timbre, right? That kind of was shining through the particular playing of someone else. But you can also have worlds where you do have incorporation, but the synthesis of the incorporation is the eventual trace itself, right? So the synthesis for any point is the body. So ultimately, I start playing like Ornette Coleman, and people say, "What are you doing?" And I cannot say, "Well, I'm exploiting timbre." I say, "I'm playing like Ornette Coleman." That's an inactive world, right? So I would say something like the constraints the new constraints introduced by the eventual trace are not passed on to the organs, right? There's nothing that is smaller than the trace or that is included in the body, that's interior to the body, that is capable of having some level of autonomy and treating things on its own right. Right? So in that case, sorry, actually I'm confusing two things. That's the case for the inorganic worlds, right? Where there are no organs. Inactive worlds are worlds where is the difference here? The body, so all points are treated by the trace, and that's inactive. Only the trace treats the points. And inorganic is when the envelope of the treated points is the trace, right? So you don't get a second envelope or a more regional envelope like an organ. So that gives us all the ways that something can go wrong. No isolates, so no sites. Sites, but the eventual trace is never maximal. Eventual trace is maximal, but nothing incorporates. There is some incorporation, but that incorporation is synthesized by the trace, always by the trace, right? And there are points being treated. No, all points are treated by the trace, and points are treated by something that is not the trace, but the envelope of that region remains the trace. So that's all that can go wrong. I'm gonna leave subjective induction for next week. I know everyone is tired and probably saying that you have to go. Yeah. So, but I think we basically covered
all the book.
Basically, we covered
the
all
entire
the book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, we covered the whole book.
Yeah, that's fantastic. You should definitely send this drawing to us. So I want to watch this again before next week. So to have this well mapped in my head. So yeah, this is great.
One thing that okay, I'll leave it to next week. I just I know Reza needs to go, but it's something that I actually wanted to discuss. Just leave it hanging in the air because it would be useful if some work was done by us to deal with this before next meeting, which is the following. If the screen helps me, I can show you. Apparently, it's not helping. But I was thinking that we could do something. Let me just see if I have it here. No, I don't. But, my idea for next meeting was to discuss things that are kind of parallel to this whole. So this is what we covered today.
Okay.
That is parallel to this. So I just separated some questions because I think, Caron, especially because I know you're well versed in these debates, perhaps this would be interesting for us, which is this thing here. If it like pleases to just thanks.
It's like a slow zoom in, very suspenseful.
Very suspenseful. So this is things that I thought we could talk about next time that are connected to all that we discussed today, but they're more speculative. So please screen, please help me. Very suspenseful.
Yeah, I can kind of read it though. I mean, just only 0.3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right?
Yeah, I'm just gonna go up here now. It should work. But yeah, my idea is just some questions that I think are kind of parallel to all of this, but I think we didn't have time to talk about them. But they're always kind of coming to mind or in our discussions in one way or another. And I thought we could treat them. Just the one thing that is not here. So things that I thought we could discuss for next week, and some of them require some preparation. So just one discussion that I think is important, which is, okay, but what is not a world ultimately? Yeah. So what the hell is not a world then, right? So that's a question I think we should deal with. But then also this other question here, which I think is very interesting, which is what kind of philosophy is this thing we just read? And I think that there are 4 other philosophies we could compare it to. Transcendental realism and this strain of computationalism. So how is this distinct from the materialist treatment of the transcendental that is going on today? Then
which is normally more what's more familiar to me now. Yeah, like transcendental realism. Yeah.
Then what is the relation of these to object-oriented ontologies? Because they also propose a new concept of the object. So new concept of the transcendental is the first. New concept of the object is in the second. Then multinaturalism and this whole relational ontologies, they're trying to propose a new concept of relation. Right? And then there is the whole theory of the subject that comes from dialectical materialism and the whole Hegelian-Lacanian materialism. So it seems to me that Badiou can be measured with regards to these 4 strands, which I think pretty much cover contemporary philosophy today, in a certain sense, right? Or the new positions in contemporary philosophy. So I thought we could talk about how it relates to this. And I think this is good food for thought. So I rather introduce it now than leave it for next week.
Yeah, that's good.
Another thing, like types of worlds that he didn't discuss. For example, how can we define perhaps the world of consciousness? It's something we kind of we've mentioned very briefly, but it's something we perhaps could go into. How can we recuperate the distinction between natural and historical worlds from being an event? Which
This
is
is something that came up in our class a lot.
Yeah, so that would be nice. So how can we distinguish between fictional and also counterfactual worlds? So perhaps going a bit more into a more classic analytic theory of worlds, right? So which
it seems to me that Badiou's notion of world is modally neutral. So yeah,
so there's something interesting there. Then the physiognomy of bodies. So how can we distinguish with this formalism between hierarchical bodies, for example, non-subjectivized bodies? After all, you saw that bodies that treat points require, bodies require the eventual trace because they became maximal. But can we have is a body that is not subjectivized distinct from an object? Can it still be distinct from an object? So in the sense, is the category of body applicable to the living body, or is the living body pretty much just a living object? Right. So that correlation between bodies and objects, and where is the distinction coming from? Then I think that there are three questions that are more general, but I think that can we come up with a concept of experience and a concept of reality that takes all of this that we've discussed into consideration, so we can actually go back to regular philosophical debate and bring this with us, you know? How would we conceptualize these things if we know they're not intra-worldly, but perhaps a way of the way that worlds, my current take is that reality is the way that worlds inhabit something else. Like
something like
the
that.
shopping mall
because
world.
If a notion of world is modally neutral, it seems that you could have a world that it simply does not happen. Like it's not part of reality, but it's a world. Mm-hmm. So a reality has to be something bigger than world in a sense. Or
you know what I was thinking?
It could be a predicate as well, like a predicate you apply to a world. So in a sense, like a part of another transcendental, but then you reinstate, the one. So it's got a whole bunch of issues there. So
I think that reality should perhaps be considered in this sense, because he has a definition of real for atoms. So perhaps reality is something like the set of elements of multiples that are mobilized by real atoms. Some crazy thing like this. Like, I don't know, it's a big discussion, but I think it's interesting. Then I think the whole discussion on experimentation, which I know we're interested in, and we could also go into it. I think
that's quite interesting, this definition, like the set of multiples that is mobilized by real atoms, because if you go, for instance, into consciousness or in fictional worlds, you can have thoughts that are fictional, but they are nevertheless mobilizing something that is a real multiple that is part of an atom. Of course, it depends on how you define the transcendental over such a thing. Like
but there's something to it, I think.
There's something to it. There's something to it. Like even for the philosophy of mind, I'm hinting like there's something to it. Yeah.
And another question of experimentation. Dennis recently in a conversation with me was talking about certain properties of lattices where you can have strains in these lattices that are actually totally separate from other strains, right? This sort of autonomy of these organs, right? Because it seems to me that this is not guaranteed by the clause of the organ. So my idea was to also explore a bit more the inner structure of bodies that allow for experiments and bodies that can only allow for experiences. I think that we can make the distinction. And then this discussion on pragmatism and truth, because the whole discussion of the body is actually a discussion of efficaciousness, capacity, effect. It's very Spinozian in a certain sense, but it's actually everything is conditioned on this theory of truth, right? So how are these things being bound together here? And this, I think, would close up this discussion before we go to the political stuff. So
that's quite nice.
Yeah, they're great questions.
Okay, that said,
fantastic presentation.
Yeah, it's really good.
This is the one we'll get back to several times because it was the entire book. So
this envelope everything. This is the
Yeah, this
efficacious part right here. This presentations.
Great,
Come back.
guys.
Yeah.
Sleep well.
All right. Sleep well,
Yeah.
guys.
You too.
Bye bye.
Bye.